And a few years later, the
on fighting
house,
crime, it wasn't.
Okay, we're live.
a little under $1 million. So
Wow.
So this is our weekly basic income discussion group. Hi, everybody who's eventually going to be watching this. So this week we're talking about climate and the environment. And most people, when you're talking about basic income, you're thinking, well, what does that have to do with climate and the environment? So we have a pretty small group here today. And I'm going to start by, this is Bethany's idea, I'm going to start by going around and asking everyone what they think basic income has to do with climate and the environment. So let's start with Bethany.
Okay, I'm going to bring up 3 different things.
Yeah.
So one thing that could come to mind is that the more money you give to people, especially if you're imagining going internationally with basic income, the more resources people can use, and that could put additional stress on the environment. So that's kind of one major thing. A second sort of thing in the opposite direction is perhaps when you're more resource rich, you can afford to be more efficient with resources or to invest in things for the future, like more sustainable kinds of energy. You see wealthier countries more able to do this kind of thing than newly developing countries. So giving people more money could work in the opposite direction. And then the third thing is even environmental impact kind of held constant if poverty is lower, then people's ability to cope with that impact is increased. So you can imagine people with a basic income could move if a certain environment gets too hot, whereas if they didn't have a basic income, they would have to be there. Same with flooding and other kinds of things. So that's those 3 thoughts on everything.
Okay.
Like if we see massive climate change.
Yeah, that's good.
So I'm just going to limit it to saying that there are some beliefs that basic income would change consumption patterns, and that consumption patterns impact the environment one way or the other.
Okay. Good.
Yeah, everything's taken now.
Sorry.
I had
I was
nothing
going to
else.
say I should go last.
Yeah. All been
Okay.
taken.
Do you feel
All I
like
thought of was said.
do you feel like you agree with what other people have said so
Yes. Yeah.
far? Okay. All right. Richard.
Depending on the level of basic income, if it's high enough, people might not have to commute to work, and that would reduce, like they were saying in the New York article, all the pollution and things in the air with the automobiles, as they said.
Yep, I think that's a really good one. And I think along those lines, a more general way of framing that is that jobs take up resources. And if people are doing work that doesn't need to be done, if there are businesses that maybe wouldn't exist anymore under a basic income because the economy is more efficient and it's eliminated some of these unnecessary industries and all of that, then you're not only polluting less for people commuting to work at their jobs, but also these industries as a whole are maybe wasting fewer resources and polluting less as well. So I think that's one of the huge beneficial effects we might see from a basic income. And then of course I agree with Martin that it changes consumption patterns, and obviously if we're consuming more, that uses up more resources as well. So there might be, a lot of times we talk about what is the optimal level of basic income for people and for the economy. And if we factor in the environmental impact of consumption, maybe that would cause us to want to have a lower basic income so we can serve more resources and maybe mitigate the total amount of consumption in the economy.
Yeah, like what Bethany said though about it being the opposite too, that having more basic income would allow people to do things like not worry about spending money on conserving or higher prices for products that are paper rather than plastic, and sort of putting their resources there.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah, so it's hard to think about. And also, like they said, like moving, or like if the climate unavoidably gets
The
hotter, like
moving
moving
part
to other
too,
locations, building up other kinds of infrastructure.
Yeah.
I mean, like you see even now, like when there's a hurricane or an earthquake that hits a poorer area, it's way more devastating than when it hits a richer area because there's the infrastructure to deal with it and the preventative measures and all that. So
yeah, so in terms of our ability to adapt to climate change and cope with, that kind of stuff, if we don't have poverty, that makes a huge difference.
Right.
Yeah.
And like just to add to that, or to re-emphasize that, there's this general sort of function of being resource poor, where you end up doing sort of long-term damaging things more often because you can't afford to be sort of forward thinking.
Right.
And so like you maybe have to cut down the rainforest to farm because it's certainly a way to make money. Whereas if you have more options, or like when governments have the option to pay people not to do that and so on, you can have a more long-term view.
Yeah, go ahead.
Or like how people in India and places like that, they have these really inefficient stoves that cause health problems because they don't have like chimneys or something like that.
Yeah, all this kind of stuff.
I mean, what would it have been like in Puerto Rico if people had basic income, for example? Just trying to think about this scenario of climate change or a big catastrophe and poverty as a result.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah, it's interesting because we can think of basic income as a form of infrastructure that's funded by the government.
right.
Another form of infrastructure that's funded by, or at least supported by the government, is the electrical grid, right? So,
Right.
there's still people in Puerto Rico who don't have electricity.
Right, that's what I mean.
Yeah.
There are other aspects to it. They can't get it out of themselves, even if they did have.
Yeah, I mean,
Their
I
own
guess
personal
if it were
income.
high enough in income, people would just leave. I
Would leave.
because
Yeah.
it's just like so bad. And
Right.
If,
Right.
if the
They would be
government's
able
not
to leave.
fixing it, they would be able to leave.
Or,
Like, where would they go?
Well, that depends.
Well,
So in
Puerto
Rico,
Ricans
they
are
can go to
American
the United
citizens.
States. So if we're
Yeah.
really focusing in on that example, they would leave.
Yeah.
And what impact would that have on the cost of living where they go?
It would go up, but that would also provide an incentive for the government to do something about the electricity there. Right, like if the people have the freedom to leave, then there might be some additional incentive not to make, like, to fix the
Right,
conditions.
they don't have that freedom right now. They're depending on federal aid, disaster relief aid
Yeah.
that is coming.
So an interesting point that you made is that if they had a basic income, but they don't have this other stuff, then maybe it won't make as
Make a
much of a
difference.
difference.
Right,
Yeah.
that's a good point too.
So I think that really speaks to the point that basic income is just one part of infrastructure that needs to be provided for people.
Right.
If you have nothing to buy, then basic income isn't going to help that much. Although if you had a basic income in Puerto Rico and, well, yeah, I guess we don't have internet here in trouble, but maybe you have internet on your phone and you can buy stuff from Amazon or something like that.
Maybe long distance, but
I think one of the fundamental problems there is that the government of Puerto Rico doesn't have any money.
right.
So Puerto Rico is kind of like a state in the United States, but it's a territory, and we bail out places like Texas that get hit by hurricanes differently than we treat Puerto Rico.
Apparently.
Yeah.
And also Puerto Rico went bankrupt a few years ago, so they don't have access to money.
So they have access to money.
They don't have.
They
Don't.
don't
They
have
don't.
access to money. Yes. That's right.
And also, I've heard that one of the reasons why the government is stuck, isn't providing disaster relief to Puerto Rico is because the people, developers want all the land that would be freed up by people wanting to move away or lowering prices, people not being able to improve their houses or anything like that.
Huh, that's interesting. And I mean, it's interesting too because we know that we could fix this problem by giving the Puerto Rican government a lot of money,
Right.
So when we talk about basic income, we talk about governments paying money to individual citizens, but then you can also think of a kind of a similar thing at the level of the higher up government, giving money to the lower governments in the hierarchy. So,
Right.
the federal government funding the states and the states funding the towns and
And
stuff
we're
like
kind
that.
of dependent on that too. I mean, basic income isn't going to change that. I mean,
Basic
it
income
affects
isn't,
that.
it's not going to change the fact that you need some services and
Right.
infrastructure to be provided by the government.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. So Sultan is online. Hi, Sultan. Feel free to chime in with any comments at any time. So does anyone have any more thoughts before I get to the first quote?
I have one thought, but we can
Yeah.
flag it for later. It has to do with whether, if you're worried about consumption based on the basic income, you want to do that with the level of the basic income versus like targeted taxes or other policies.
Yeah.
So that's just kind of a general
So that's a good question. I think if there are certain specific resources we want to conserve, then it makes sense to tax the use of those resources. So a really good example of this, I think, is beef. So beef takes up a ton of natural resources. It takes up a ton of land, and it produces a lot of carbon emissions.
A lot of
Methane.
Carbon emissions.
And
yeah.
methane, yeah.
Well,
right,
methane is a
yeah,
form of carbon.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you've got, wait, is methane a form of carbon? I think so.
Methane's more,
It has a higher greenhouse gas
Yes.
efficiency.
Than CO2, yeah. But it dissipates faster, but it's still that. Yeah, so
CH4.
it also
Yeah, those
uses
got
up
carbon.
more water, and you have to use more feed to produce a lower amount of meat.
right. It's in terms of the amount of calories produced for food, it's a lot more wasteful than even other kinds of meat, but especially more wasteful than vegetables. So if we taxed something like beef production or the sale of beef, then that could help reduce some of the environmental impact of our consumption.
Yeah, but,
Yeah.
I mean, that's a whole other thing, taxing beef. I mean, there are so many lobbyists that would be against such a thing.
Yeah, there's lobbyists that are against pretty much everything we talk about in this
right,
room.
so,
Yeah.
so just saying that is a possible thing, it's not that easy.
Yeah, I mean, when I say possible, I mean like it's something that if we did it, it would help address the problem.
Yeah,
Like, I mean, we're talking about basic income here, and most people are not going to be for basic income either.
No, but I mean, taxing things, if we get into taxing things,
Yeah.
that's a different discussion than what basic income alone does to affect.
Sure.
Yeah, that's right. I think it's just a question of like if you were to try to design the ideal system, maybe it's not that politically viable. But that was the exercise I was thinking. Like, what would be ideal? Would you want to? Because I guess what I was thinking is some of the things that basic income could go towards don't really harm the environment that much. Maybe you're paying for, a therapist or maybe whatever things that don't really use
Nothing
up
to do with
too much resources,
Right.
whereas other things might use up a lot of resources.
Right.
So one way to do it would be to keep the basic income low, but then you might be unnecessarily costing people from the things that they could do that wouldn't use up a
Yeah,
lot of
right,
resources.
right,
Or another
yeah.
thing would be to try to target with other kinds of policies like taxes, like the specific things that you don't want people to be using as much.
Taxes are making it more expensive.
Right.
Well, that's
they
what
Out
direct,
of reach.
Exactly.
That's what the taxes do.
kind of direct people's use
Yeah.
of the money in
Right.
ways that aren't so costly for the environment. That's
Right,
what
Yeah.
gotcha. I wasn't
So-
thinking of taxing as a way of directing them.
That's
Yeah,
how I was
I-
thinking of it. How
I
do you
mean,
direct people's spending?
Yeah, you're still right about the political objections.
Right.
But I think most of the time in this discussion group, we try to not worry too much about the political reality and, obstacles to, convincing people that something is a good idea and
Right.
more talk about it on like an effectiveness type level
Yeah.
of discussion. Yeah.
I'm not to be argumentative, but
Yeah.
I mean, in basic income, it really hasn't been proven one way or the other yet. It hasn't been done.
Right.
But in terms of beef tax, I mean, there have been lots of objections and lots of people have wanted to do that particular thing, that particular kind of taxation,
Right.
just to help the environment. And it's always been shut down. So I'm just speaking from
Right.
the
Yeah.
reality of that versus, right, basic income, we
Yeah.
don't know.
Right.
I mean, that's fine. I'm just saying, like, for the purposes of the discussion in this group, we're not worrying too much about political obstacles and stuff like that. We're talking about what's going to
Yeah. If Alex Hallett were here, I bet he would say that people not having to get all their incomes from their jobs might affect those politics if jobs are the justification for shooting down tax. As a
Yeah.
Right.
If who were here,
If you're worried,
If he was.
if I was here,
What? I was making a joke.
if
Because I
you're
was
worried,
just saying one of his points.
right?
Sorry.
yeah, that was when you're probably object to that.
If we don't have, jobs that are depending on, the beef industry,
Yes.
or maybe there are jobs that are depending on it, but there aren't the people aren't depending on those jobs staying around.
Right.
Then that might take some of the power out
That's
of the lobby.
That's
Go
true.
ahead.
There already are automated systems for butchering beef and lamb and stuff like that. So there's less and less of a need for those jobs.
So there's the technological unemployment aspect.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I'd hate to fall into one of those machines.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I think that's a good point. And a lot of these lobbies you see for various jobs related stuff and steel industry, all this kind of stuff, a lot of times the jobs aren't really there anymore.
Right.
but the lobby kind of lingers on for a little
Or
while.
like for tariffs for the steel industry.
Yeah, that kind of thing.
Yeah. And this kind of relates to our like political power and financial inequality discussion. I love that too. Like these lines can be very powerful.
Sure. Yeah. Anyway, I wanted to get back to Bethany's point about conserving resources. Because when we say resources, we kind of think, okay, the planet has, a finite amount of resources that are available. Some of it's renewable and some of it's renewable to a certain extent or whatever. But not all resources are the same. So there's some resources like sunlight where we can just put our solar panels out there and soak it in, right?
Right.
Then that kind of brings up the issue of consumption. Like when environmentalists talk about reducing consumption, they're talking about reducing the waste of the resources that we would preferably like to conserve because they're limited. Does that make sense?
Mhm. Yeah.
Right. But when economists talk about consumption, they're talking about how much stuff people are getting. What?
No, it's not just the waste of resources we want to preserve, it's also consuming certain things that harm the environment. Like we were just talking about beef. So if you're not consuming beef, it's better for the environment.
Yeah.
It's not about,
It's not just
I mean,
limited,
we can
yeah.
think of this is a little abstract, but we can think of the clean environment or the healthy environment as a resource that we only have a certain amount of. So then pollution is a depletion of that resource. So we can still kind of frame it in the same kind of thinking if we want to. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It's a little bit counterintuitive, but it's still the same argument still applies.
it's a resource that gets sullied by use, too much use.
So let's forget about that, and instead of saying resources, just say wasting resources or causing pollution.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
yeah.
I was just trying to simplify it a little bit, but I made it more complicated.
Yeah.
So we can think of so when environmentalists talk about consumption, they're talking about waste of natural resources, the kind of things we want to conserve, and they're talking about pollution, like harming the environment and the byproducts of consumption.
Right.
When economists talk about consumption, they're talking about how much benefit the people are getting from the economy. So there's consumption in the economic sense doesn't necessarily have to have anything to do with actually polluting anything
Right.
or using up natural resources that we need to conserve or something like that. So when we talk about economic growth, when economists talk about economic growth, they're talking about getting more benefit for the people. And when environmentalists talk about economic growth, they're worried about like this machine that's causing damage and wasting things. Yeah. So it's important to have kind of those two different perspectives in mind, because sometimes economists and environmentalists will talk past each other because the economist will be pro-growth and then the environmentalist will say, well, how can you just be arbitrarily pro-growth, because it's so damaging. Yeah. So I think that speaks to Bethany's point about resources, and they're not all the same. So anyone else have any thoughts before we get to a quote?
Sultan agrees that people need to eat less meat.
Sultan agrees that people need to eat less meat. Yeah, I mean, I think that would help a lot. Yeah. So here we go. So here's a quote from the first article. It says, but can we really escape booming production and consumption? The fate of species encountering vast new resources is exponential growth and then collapse, epitomized by the rapid expansion and eventual death of bacteria growing in a petri dish. So I think here the author, or what do you guys think about this quote?
I'm wondering about the word optimized. Or, it's epitomized?
Epitomized.
Okay, got it.
Yeah. Yeah. What do you think, Leslie?
I think it's a good metaphor for the point that the author's trying to make.
Yeah. So I think the author is thinking about production and consumption in this particular case, mostly from the environmentalist perspective, rather than from the economic perspective. Or maybe he's conflating the two of them and not drawing a distinction.
Yeah.
Because in the sense of booming production and consumption from the economy, there's no reason why we necessarily need to escape it, but we would want to enjoy our economic benefits, our benefits of production, while doing minimal harm to the environment. And I think kind of both of these things are achievable. So I don't know that we, in the sense of what an economist would say is production and consumption and growth, I don't know that we need to escape that per se, but we certainly do want our businesses to be more efficient environmentally.
Sultan is worried about the limited resource of water in particular. She's like making some comments there.
Okay.
About that.
Yeah. So Sultan says most of the people tend to think that we can have limitless fresh water by using ocean water, but this way also creates lots of pollution since there would be plenty of salt as outcome. They put the salt to deserts.
So Sultan, I'm slightly confused. I don't know if anyone else understands. I'm not sure the problem that salt has.
Yeah, I don't think salt is generally a pollutant, and it's kind of safe to just store. And like we also use it on our food and all of that. I guess in the sense that when you're cleaning up the ocean water, you're also extracting more from it than salt. But it's
Well, in the process of doing it may create pollution too. The machinery that you use.
certainly the energy used will
Yeah.
cause carbon emissions and stuff like that.
Unless it's solar powered.
Right.
Right.
Are most people familiar with desalinization?
No, maybe,
How it's done?
maybe you can speak to this because I don't know.
Yeah. Go ahead.
The owners I mentioned, when I was in the Middle East in the first Gulf War, I had to meet with some mayor because we needed water for construction. We needed to tap some of their wells, and so there was a bit of negotiation stuff. And I was shocked that the mayor, this is like a little village off someplace kind of, right, started asking me if in return for access to their wells, if I could provide use of a reverse osmosis. So, and I guess, so I was an Army engineer, we didn't have it. The Air Force actually has most of the reverse osmosis. This reverse osmosis, and it's really the only way to desalinate water, is extremely expensive.
Yeah.
It is very energy intensive. And I mean, even, Sultan's, I'm not sure exactly what she's referring to because the notion of removing salt from ocean water and then using water in agriculture, I'm not sure, what the economics. In a place like Saudi Arabia where they can spend, and they are, expending, there's some pretty, I think there's at least one really major desalinization project going on. But anyway, just in the bigger scheme of things, I don't know that the salt or the effluent that, when you reverse osmosis, that stuff is so much the challenge. It's simply the cost of the equipment and the cost of running it.
I was thinking of more drinking water, not the scale of agriculture, but that
Yeah.
makes a lot of sense. I mean, I would imagine, and this is a bit of a tangent, like the future of that might have to do more with those people who are like growing plants with pretty minimal water, because they have them in like
Hydroponics.
hydroponics, and they're going to practically just a building or something. But anyway, this is a really totally side point.
She's
So-
talking about the salt polluting the soil, so the salting goes
It's
back.
true, you're not gonna grow in salt.
You're
Right.
not going to grow in salt.
Putting
there are
it in
plenty
a
of
desert
places to
You
put
can
salt.
put it somewhere else.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's too much of a problem.
I wanted to.
Um,
Oh, go ahead.
I was curious why you can't use evaporation to
And capture it.
evaporate
good
away the
question.
water vapor.
In survival training, you're actually taught a couple of different methods of doing that, but that's barely survival.
Okay.
It just takes
It's
too long.
not, I mean, again, the quantities, the amount of effort, if you're doing
Okay.
solar, sufficient solar radiation, sort of different way. If you've ever read the book, Unbroken, I think is the book about the Olympic athlete, World War II soldier, survived a crash bomber, and the whole thing, and a lot of his survivals, he's on it's a crazy story. I mean, the guy just survived against this totally impossible,
Okay.
and comes back and just things.
So what were you gonna say?
I was just going to point out two things that might be different between people and this example.
Yeah.
And one is something that we've alluded to before, which is like the kind of population leveling off, at least currently seeming to be on that trend, which obviously
Yeah.
the bacteria are not doing. And so like there's just this endless expansion of the population there that we aren't seeing in people. And then, yeah, I guess that's the main thing. And then of course they're just using kind of one basic resource that's very limited and
Yeah.
not sort of renewable in time and that kind of thing.
Right, like for a lot of the stuff we humans need, we can substitute one resource for another resource and potentially lessen our impact on the environment. Yeah, I think that's true. Okay.
You know, it's a good metaphor.
The other thing I would add on that quote,
Yeah.
almost as you read that quote, you know, as I read the next couple of lines, that quote alone almost seems out of context. Because it seems like what the author is, you know, right after that quote, there's sort of this counterintuitive that the Earth's population is stabilizing and birth rates are declining,
Right.
which is consistent with rising economic prosperity,
Right.
which also seems kind of counter
Yeah, that's right.
intuitive.
I agree. And in general, like another thing I meant to point out was that people's spending in terms of people's use of actual resources maybe doesn't ever completely flatten, but certainly like goes down in the sense that for every dollar you give them more and more, they're not like using like more and more as if they were like another like choice is if you gave two people that amount of money or like split it between two
Right.
people or something like that. So there might not be this exponential expansion.
Right.
Right, it'd be a lot
You know-
at the beginning,
Right.
you know, getting necessities, but
Exactly.
you don't have to buy a chair twice.
Right. It
Right.
goes
Want
into
two
like
chairs, but
luxury items or that kind of
Right.
stuff, which doesn't always use up that much.
Right. When a rich person is spending a lot of money, they're usually not buying, 50,000 hamburgers.
right.
They're buying, like one really, really fancy hamburgers and then showing off how much money they spent on it and that kind of thing.
Right.
Which doesn't use up that many resources. So rich people, spending kind of indiscriminately or seemingly indiscriminately to show off is not, they're not necessarily trying to use up a lot of resources, and they don't. Really.
Right.
Yeah. So this next quote is pretty much saying the same thing, which is why I put them together. He's saying the core dynamic of ever greater production and consumption of goods and resources must be broken. So again, if we're talking about goods and resources that are renewable or that we're able to produce without damaging the environment, then maybe not a problem so much. And depending on how people spend their money, we can direct that spending through taxes or other means towards more efficient.
What do you think
Yeah.
environmental impact would look like per citizen of Norway over the past 30 or 40 years? Like, I'm kind of wondering if it still looks like an increasing environmental impact per person, or if it doesn't, because they've done a lot to like try to have an environmentally friendly way of getting energy, and they like maybe aren't really using that many more items than they did 30 years ago. They're just using computers instead of typewriters, or I don't know. I wonder.
I think that's a good question. I think probably since Norway isn't very densely populated, I don't know if their overall impact in Norway is increasing, but I would say they probably have a higher environmental impact than countries that are more densely populated, where most of the people are in ginormous cities and that kind of thing.
Yeah, that makes sense. And that's another point we brought up, which is that people become less environmentally impactful when they concentrate into cities, which is another trend that we've seen.
Less environmental.
Yeah, it's counterintuitive because cities themselves can seem quite polluted, but the people are getting out of the rest of the planet. So like they're like leaving more natural space, but also it's more efficient. They tend to live in smaller houses
Right.
or apartments.
Yeah,
And it's just like using up less
cities
energy.
being very
The city
polluted.
itself is polluted, but if you imagine like spreading that energy use out, if you're in the suburbs, you're like driving farther.
Right.
You don't have all this
Yeah.
concentrated infrastructure that's really efficient. You're using you're having 10 times the size of a living structure as you would have in New York.
Right. Yeah.
So there's that kind of stuff
Yeah.
that's interesting. But my question was different, which was like when you're already like fairly wealthy, what do we see in these examples of these populations? Do we see a trajectory towards actual increased consumption from the environmental perspective or not?
I know that's what your question was. I was saying I didn't know the answer to that,
Right.
but I had an answer to another question. Yeah. Yeah, I think it's hard to say. I mean, we can imagine that technology gets more efficient, so there's less of an impact in that way, but we can also imagine that they have greater access to more stuff. So maybe it's more of an impact because of that. I think it's an interesting question. I don't know if we can answer it right now. Yeah.
Will you reframe that again, that question? What is the question?
I'm just wondering, like, if we have real examples already of like fairly well-to-do populations and what happens with their environmental impact. Like, is it just increasing, or is it kind of like, in the 80s, people and wealthy people had kind of the same kind of stuff that they were consuming as now?
That brings to
In
mind
terms
too
of
this
resources.
idea that if basic income in the beginning, people might be spending on things that they don't already have. But
Right.
once they have them, I mean, there's a stabilization that goes on
Right,
so that they're not continuously expanding and spending.
right.
They're only spending in a targeted way, and they're maybe more frugal because they're only getting a certain amount of income.
Right.
And that's, I mean, wealthy people have what they need. So do they then, like Alex said, would they then go ahead anyway and keep spending on
So
bigger and better things and making more environmental impact, or just?
So I think what Bethany is asking is rich people who are already rich, over the course of time, as technology changes and as the economy changes, do they have more of a negative impact on the environment as we move into the future, or do they have less of a negative impact on the
Right,
environment?
but why would they have more of a negative impact?
So, yeah, go ahead, Richard.
There's like planned obsolescence, like with cars breaking down after a certain mileage point, or there's also like telephones. They're like, I think like the iPhone, they get a new one every like 6 months or something, and that uses a lot of like rare earth metals and
Yeah.
things like that.
Yeah, certainly stuff like that is not good for the environment. I think I don't know how a basic income would affect that. I would imagine that maybe there'd be fewer businesses trying to, maximize the amount of stuff they're selling to people if they're, the individual people in the society aren't as worried about their survival or their jobs and that kind of thing. And there'd be less incentive for, government economic policy to incentivize these kinds of businesses as well. So that might help.
Yeah, I think that the impact of like powerful companies is a really big issue for the environment, kind of the political impact, independent of in basic income or not, because it's just such a big public goods problem that you really need policies to help solve the environmental impact, and governments need to be able to do that. And if they're too influenced by like political lobbies from wealthy people or wealthy companies, it could be a big issue.
Yeah, it's hard to say to what extent they are influenced by the big companies right now.
Who are influenced by
The government,
Oh.
right? Because the government has an incentive to promote private investment and private businesses, to create jobs and that kind of thing. Once you take away that incentive, I don't know how much pressure is going to be left on the government to do this kind of thing. It's an interesting
pressure
question.
to protect. I mean, look what's happening with the steel industry, protecting the coal miners where there's no,
Right.
coal
Yeah.
mine anymore. There's no.
Well, there's
or
plenty of
being
coal to mine,
replaced. It's
but there's
being replaced by other sources of energy. But there's still a big push to protect all of those.
right. Yeah, that kind of thing. Yeah. Richard, did you have something?
I don't remember anymore.
All right.
Just on this,
Yeah, go ahead.
some environmental issues are also global public goods problems. So they require governments to kind of coordinate with each other.
Yeah.
Like, one country like Norway might be doing a great job reducing their emissions, but they're still going to get kind of screwed if nobody else is doing that. So that's another reason, like, that you don't see governments acting as often as you would like, is this global issues.
Right.
What do you mean they're going to get screwed?
Like, I mean, it's a global public goods problem in the sense that every country might individually have the incentive to free ride on the other countries, right? It's like to pollute themselves so that they can have economic profit or whatever, and try to get the other countries to be the ones that reduce it. Or conversely, even if you try to reduce it, you're not necessarily going to see the benefit unless other countries also reduce it emissions. global, you know what a public goods problem is. Climate change is a global public goods problem.
I think it's, I mean, I think this is kind of a backwards thing because people, countries want to maximize their industry to create jobs and, like provide, for people and maximum benefit for the people. But this issue, like if you think of Norway deciding not to pollute as much, not to have as much industry, if it's then the other countries that are all polluting themselves and selling stuff to Norway, then Norway is the one who wins. They have less emissions, less pollution, and they also get more stuff.
Okay, that's fair, but I think I didn't make my point clear, which is
No,
that
you did. I was just like, I
have-
wanted to bring up this objection to it, or this counter.
I don't think that's really any kind of counterpoint to my point.
Okay.
Which was just that in general you won't see agents doing as much as you'd like when it's a public goods problem. And so since you don't have one organization in charge of the whole world,
Right.
it's really, really hard to solve this problem.
My point is that this is only a public goods problem because of this belief in the economic theory that more production within your own country is good and that exports are better than imports and that kind of thing. When people realize that is actually not how the world works, then the public goods problem disappears.
I disagree. I'm sure there'll always be efforts needed to like try to reduce energy emissions that are costly. I don't think that's
Yeah,
I've heard that 100 companies produce like 70% of carbon emissions. So if you can regulate those companies, then that would drastically lower it. But it's not really politically viable at the moment.
Right.
So it's just not going to happen like with a carbon tax or something.
Yeah, and like companies can jump countries now too, right? It's like one country tries to regulate, they can go somewhere else. So it has to be like this coordinated effort. It's really hard.
Yeah. So Sultan says she liked the idea of mass-scale forest restoration. So one of the things that's brought up in the first article is the idea of, confining people to specific parts of the world, and then letting nature, take back over the other parts. And I think that's a great idea. And I think,
Happened at Chernobyl.
I thought
It happened at Chernobyl,
too.
yeah.
Or the DMZ between North and South Korea.
Yeah. So yeah, we just need more like
Horrible
nuclear
disaster.
accidents and that kind of thing. Then we'll be just fine.
And it's gonna take a while, Chernobyl is still.
Not for humans, but it's great for wildlife.
Yeah. Yep. Okay, anyone have any thoughts before we move to the next quote?
No, I guess just that as the article pointed out, like there's already a fair amount of this happening naturally. People concentrating in particular areas and other areas being.
Yeah, so there is.
Conservation, you mean?
So-
Well, not conservation, but just people moving to the cities has been a continuous
a
trend
lot,
for
yeah.
Yeah.
some century now.
And I think that's true, but I also think it's important to recognize that a lot of the land that's not in cities is being used for agriculture and
Fair.
a lot of times growing food for the meat industry, for example. We're still slashing down the rainforest in Amazon and South America, and so I think it's not just something that will naturally happen on its own. It's something that we would benefit from actually doing something active about it. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead, Martin.
And I was going to say in a couple of the other articles that, I think I keep sort of making this one point of, the limited power that we have to predict the future.
Yeah.
I had this great idea when I lived in Germany in the mid-'80s. I saw this ad for a chateau in France. It was like kind of run down way out in the countryside, and I thought, you know what? I know a lot about these new things called computers. I should just buy that chateau. If I can figure out a way to live in France, I'm going to trade bonds via satellite links to Wall Street, and I'm going to make a ton of money, and I'm going to live in this beautiful castle, and this is what the internet is going to do for us. And I was dead wrong. First, I knew nothing about trading bonds. It was just like a dream. But no, I was dead wrong. My idea was that the internet was going to cause people to leave the cities because now they would have high-speed data. This is in the 80s, right?
Yeah.
This is like long before World Wide Web. It was just had to do with what I was doing. My idea was now you don't have to live in the cities, right? Because you've got this data networks and communications and all that. Why work in the city? Because you can be outside. The exact opposite has happened.
Yeah.
Right. So, again, there's sort of this notion, so in the next articles from 1970s, Buckminster Fuller and these mental giants, geniuses, and they're looking to the future. We got limited capacity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Although one side point of that is I feel like finally now with like video conferencing and that kind of thing, you are seeing a lot more people being able to work remotely.
Yeah.
It just maybe took a lot long. I don't know if that
But they're
will
not
actually end up
becoming
with people leaving cities.
Yeah.
less urban.
Right.
So they work
Right.
remotely, so they don't have to work necessarily in that office. So there's
Right.
teaming and
Yeah.
colo and co-spacing and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
But they're not moving out of the cities. That's in
Yeah.
in this sort of real macro sense.
Yeah.
There's still 70% of the planet is X 20 miles from the Earth, whatever it is, and cities and like you say, in space and some reforestation, but as a impact of people sort of vacating.
Yeah. There's just so many, I guess, other advantages of being around
In the city,
people in
yeah.
terms of infrastructure and finding
Well,
marital partners and all this stuff.
yeah, and it's that, but it's not just that. It's also that if you want the best, highest speed internet, you got to go where the infrastructure is, and that's the cities or the areas around cities. Now, certainly we've had satellite internet forever, and that can get up to pretty high speeds, but there's also a really high latency with satellite internet. So if you're video conferencing via satellite, you're going to be delayed. So I mean, and if you're trying to play a video game over satellite, forget about it, right? So there really is the advent of the internet in some ways created more of an advantage to living in the city because that's where the internet infrastructure was the strongest, and fiber cables were being put and all that. Yeah,
Still don't have fiber optics.
I know. Can we please get some?
Somerville.
Can we get some FiOS in Somerville,
If you're
please?
watching
Verizon, hi
Yeah.
Verizon. Yeah.
My kid and Dale live out in a great place out in western Massachusetts, and friends of ours. And they built the house themselves. It's beautiful. It's rural. No internet. They can't sell it. They would like to leave,
Right.
but nobody will buy that house because there's no high-speed internet. They don't
Exactly.
have cable there.
Yeah.
They don't have it,
That's,
and
Yeah.
there's no plan from the city to put it there.
yeah.
Yep.
You can buy microwave transmission equipment if you've got line of sight. It's surprisingly cheap.
Interesting. I don't know what that is.
So yeah, we should tell Dean.
We should tell Dean.
Yeah. No, just don't stand in front of it.
I'm halfway kidding, but
Oh,
we had an emergency when this one company I worked for when we moved, and we had to get out of the building we were in, but AT&T had totally effed up our T1 lines or data lines, which the business could not operate without. We ended up buying microwave equipment from Israel to microwave from the roof of the building that we were inhabiting to the roof of the new building where we were going to. And our landlord let us keep our data lines in the old building as long as we vacated all the space. And that's what we did. And we microwaved all our data over these lines between two Boston buildings, which led me to think, I'm almost line of sight from my home in Arlington with the rooftop of this building and down my building. About after we got done a month and a half later, after all that money we spent on the microwave, just to get us through a month and a half till AT&T got unscrewed. I could just sort of turn the microwave and put an antenna on top of the house. And then I'd have, multiple T1 line access and give up my cable.
That's funny. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I think you're right, Martin, and we can certainly see in the 1970 article that a lot of what they were predicting was not what ended up happening. One of the hardest things to predict too is how society will respond to some of these changes. Yeah. So let's see. Yeah, so here's the point we were talking about before. We'll rarely recognize, I don't know how rarely it's recognized, but a lot of people don't recognize it necessarily.
I would say rarely is fair.
Rarely is fair? Okay. Well, rarely recognized, we humans have recently become the exception to this rule. Birth rates on all continents are declining, and the global population is on track to stabilize. More information in the form of girls' education has done something truly extraordinary in the context of 4 billion years of life.
Confused. The exception to what rule? The rule.
The rule of the petri dish
Yeah,
growing
okay.
until we waste all our resources
Right,
and,
okay.
and killing ourselves.
Then
Yeah.
I don't understand why girls' education is
And teaching them about
I think he's
contraceptives.
oversimplifying it, but there is
Yeah.
a relationship between girls' education and just in general girls' education and birth rates.
I mean, I don't want to just say sex education, I guess.
I guess it's more
I
than
think
just
it's more than just that. I think
Yeah.
when girls get an education, they have a lower birth rate for a lot of reasons.
because they have more
More like
other
Opportunities.
options.
And,
Yeah.
They don't
Well,
tend
no,
to
I
get married
understand
as young.
contraceptive education.
No,
But
I'm not
any
talking about that.
education,
Oh.
Even if you left out the
They can employ
contraceptive.
themselves.
Just in terms of women being
If-
educated in the world, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They
So
then
if
get
they don't
married
have
later.
The
education-
increase in
Yeah.
the ability of females to get an education.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, and if they don't have an education, the only option they have is to find a husband and get
Right.
married and have a family.
Right.
Yeah.
And of course, it relates to so many other things, like when society expects them to get married. And
Yeah. But how is that related to population, just in terms of contraceptive, right?
Well, no. So if they have other options besides getting married and having children, then that relates directly to
So there are a
population.
lot of
Even if
women
they
who now
delay
have
childbirth,
careers who
Yeah.
won't
Yes,
have,
the
don't
number of
have.
Or
children.
get married
Okay.
at 20 instead of 15 is a big difference in how many children you're likely to have and all
Yeah.
that kind of thing.
Okay.
The later
I guess
you
I
get
was-
married,
I
it's
just
hard.
worded differently in the form of education for girls. I mean, it sounds like girls' education versus other education.
It is. What do you mean?
Ooh, I guess I'm having trouble with it. It sounds like, all girls schools or just, I don't know. It seems to me like it's an education
Oh, I see what
issue,
you mean.
not a just girls' education.
Right, he's not talking about all girls schools. He's talking
No.
about the opportunity
I
that
know.
girls have to get it.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I see what you mean.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, I think he oversimplifies the issue, but I think that's not
He
the real
does.
point.
But I think this is right, and I think this is something to be
Yeah.
optimistic about.
Yeah.
The population is leveling off,
Mhm.
and Hans Rosling talked about this. He's that statistician who did all the visualizations of population growth and stuff like that. He wrote a book called Factfulness before he died.
You think
That's
that's a
pretty
good thing that population is leveling off?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah,
It's interesting
Even
because
though-
China has now lifted the
Yep.
one child per couple rule. In fact, they're encouraging now much more reproduction.
Yep.
So it isn't necessary, I mean, it can go another way.
That's because before it was 4 grandparents, 2 parents, 1 child.
Right.
So population was shrinking drastically.
Right.
They're still going to have population issues in like 50 or 30 years or 50 years, but they're trying to mitigate that by trying to have people letting people have 2 or 3
For
children.
the future, because they can see where it's going.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, so it's not like they randomly did this thing and now the population's going to start shooting up again. It's more that this is a symptom of the fact that population is leveling
Right,
off.
no, I
and
know.
birth rates are
Yeah.
declining.
But it's not always a good thing that population levels off if you just let it level off.
Um,
Then declines, possibly. Is that a good thing? I don't know, just
it's neither good nor bad. I mean, I think it means we're using up fewer resources because we
right,
have
so
fewer
in that
people.
sense, it's good.
I think we're used to a society with a pretty level population. Like other than, the U.S. has a pretty level population,
Right.
and that's kind of what we're used to. You're not used to like people having 5 or 6 kids. And you
Not
think it's
anymore.
normal. Yeah.
Not
Unless you're two
anymore.
of my brothers.
When I grew up,
Yeah.
it was always
common.
at least 4,
Right.
maybe 5, yeah.
Yeah, and I think also a lot of the reason that that countries like China and Japan also are worried about population decline is because they're thinking in terms of labor, and they're not going to have the workers to support the economy. And, there's going to be a bunch of old people and not enough young people to support them and stuff like that.
Right.
I'm not sure how concerned they should be about that if we're living in a world where we have, a lot of technology and production that doesn't necessarily require
That's a
labor in
good
order to
point.
produce stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know if China should be panicking right now. I don't know if
Right.
Japan should be panicking right now. They are, because they kind of think about this world in a certain way. But I don't know if they're really in as much trouble as they think they are.
I guess the child question relates to UBI also in the question of like, would this leveling off, which I think is a good thing, be
Yeah.
disrupted by UBI because people have more time to like spend with their kids, or they don't need to like get a job, or and you also might want to set up the UBI so that you maybe get the same amount whether or not you have kids.
Yeah.
And like otherwise you could incentivize like people to have more kids if you get UBI per kid or something like that. It
They also
could
might have time to have more kids.
they would have time, yeah, which in a way I think is good on the
Yeah.
individual level, but
Right.
if you're worried about the environment
Yeah,
and
yeah,
the
yeah.
population growth,
Right.
would you have a kind of unfortunate effect of UBI where people are like, great, now I can have 5 kids, like
Right.
I've got time.
Yeah. So I think that's an important question. And, we do observe that as people get wealthier, they have fewer children.
Yeah.
Right.
But why is that?
Yeah.
And if suddenly everyone had basic income, would that pattern still hold?
Right.
Yeah,
Um,
go ahead, Richard.
well, well, in like the Middle East, they have by law they split up the inheritance from their parents to all the children. But in like Europe, the inheritance went to the first child. So that's why I've read that that's why in Europe they were able to start like companies and things like that for the first child. But in the Middle East, they weren't able to industrialize as well because all their land and things were being split up.
Oh, interesting.
Huh.
That would be a first male child though, right? In
Yeah.
Europe. Yeah, that's interesting.
I remember reading about this as an important like innovation in Europe, actually, that they would do this primogeniture, all goes to the one person, so you can keep your estate together like that, which is kind of interesting. But of course, the other children have to be figured out somehow.
Yeah. That's interesting.
Yeah.
It's really interesting. I hadn't heard that before.
Yeah.
I learned about that. Sultan is also mentioning some things, like time for different kinds of practices that would make things more efficient, kind of on that theme. She's talking about growing vegetables or being more local.
Yeah, so maybe basic income will help people have extra time for growing their own vegetables, so there will be less pollution.
Does everybody agree with that? As you know, local growing helps decrease some pollution.
I do not agree with that.
Actually, yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know
what
what
it has to
literally
do with
growing your
anything.
own. Literally growing your own, I don't know, because maybe you just use your own body to do it. But in terms of like local farms versus,
Yeah, why is
I think what I've heard is that the concentrated large scale farms are more efficient, even if they're farther away, even including transportation. Carbon
Yes.
more
emissions,
efficient in terms of
the amount of energy per item, like energy
so
per
it
Resources,
decreases-
natural
so it would be
resources used
decreasing
up.
pollution to have larger
Yeah,
growing. Okay.
Right.
which is counterintuitive.
Yeah,
because
it
we
is.
have this kind of like
Yeah.
small scale local
Right.
farm movement.
And that's a big fad right now.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, a lot of the people that are pro-environment are also
I know.
buy
Locally
local
grown.
food,
Yes.
organic food, that kind of stuff. But these types of production are actually less efficient
Yeah, that's
and
interesting.
and largely worse for the environment.
Right.
Um,
Although I don't know
Yeah.
how that factors in with respect to growing literally your own vegetables.
well, let's imagine still that most people are living in the city, right? So you're living in a tiny apartment in New York City.
You have a window box.
You have a window box. Okay.
Right.
And the
It's
buildings,
not that you couldn't do it.
the buildings around you would like block the
Yeah.
sunlight, so the plants wouldn't grow as quickly, or would be smaller or something like that.
Yeah.
And so you wouldn't get as much. But so you would try to use like a ton of fertilizer to compensate for that, and the fertilizer would have runoff and pollute.
Right. It probably
Yeah.
wouldn't be that good. Yeah. I mean, it's also just really hard to make a lot of food in yourself. It's super inefficient. It takes a ton of time.
Yeah, to
Rome
feed
says
yourself.
he makes his own food in a small
okay.
lot.
When I was growing up, I said I grew up in this big house. We also have a pretty big yard for living in the city.
Yeah.
And my dad used to grow grapes for wine and vegetables and all that.
Grape
kind of
for
stuff.
wine, you stamp your own grapes?
Yes.
Wow,
Right. That's
Wow.
fun.
That's interesting.
And yep, we made the wine and all that, but the wine we had every night for dinner came from the 10,000 bottles of the wine, so not much of that.
Yeah.
And, my point is that, there's this idea of growing, and I mean, we had enough land, and my dad did it kind of as a hobby. He grew up on a farm. My mom had grown up on a farm, although she didn't do the whole. And so those things are out there, and you can do these things, and there's like interesting stuff going on. People thinking about different ways to use buildings, and how can you, almost do some of this urban art, agriculture, and all that. And you can do a lot. I don't say you can't do a lot. Put your mind to it.
Yeah.
But I feel like where we are today, I agree with you that the sort of industrial scale farming is less energy intensive, at least in some types of products. So there may be some products actually that you could grow locally and you'd net out better by growing locally, but there are others that you can't. So point just being catch all one broad statement that's well, all local is better, or all industrial is better, whatever.
Yeah. And I think, well, let's see. So Jeff is mentioning that there's no greenhouse gases from transporting produce. And that's true, but I think the greenhouse gases from transporting the produce are only a tiny amount of the environmental impact if you're having large-scale food production. I think it's negligible. So saving on that is not a huge thing. And kind of, find a source on that, please, so that my statement will not be incorrect anymore. I think Martin is right about the idea that growing your own food is fine as a hobby, and it's probably going to stay as a hobby for most people. Most people would prefer not to grow their own food, and we came from a past where everybody was growing their own food, and we moved on from that, and that was progress, and that's more efficient, and it allows us to do other things in society. It allows people to do other things and enrich themselves in other ways, and it allows our production to be more efficient. Now, Jeff is saying, growing food in suburbia is possible if one has time and energy. Of course, one has to have the time and the energy and the motivation. It has to be I really like growing food, right? And obviously, most people don't live in suburbia. So that's, many people grow in Silicon Valley, but the majority do not. And I think that makes sense.
And that was a big motivation in the 60s. There was a kind of utopian feel to communes where people would grow their own food instead of, buying from a capitalist society.
Yeah.
But those communes were really failed because people did not want to do that work. I mean, yeah. But there was a motivation. There just wasn't the energy, and it didn't last for that reason.
Yeah.
It was hard work.
If you're spending all your time thinking about your ideology of utopia and whatever, you're not spending your time growing tomatoes.
That's right. And they would rather spend their time thinking about utopia.
Right, exactly. Fresh food is better tasting. That is probably true. But nevertheless, it's, beef is really good tasting too, but it's also bad for the environment. So, yeah.
People don't grow their own cows.
Some of them do. Yeah. Anyone have any more thoughts on that before we move on? These guys are talking about tomatoes.
You can also do I heard that they're in New Jersey. They're starting with all these hydroponics and things like that. They these high-rise buildings.
Oh, yeah.
Like the aeroponics, even.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a really efficient way to grow food, and I'm excited about that. But that's very different from hobby farming and growing your own food. Yeah.
It's hard to find some stores on
Okay. So, I picked this one. Universal basic income is a policy whereby a financial payment is made to every citizen unconditionally without any obligation to work at a level above their subsistence needs. And I just, so this is the perspective that's being taken in the article, and I just wanted to remind everyone that that's not the definition of basic income we use here in our discussion. It's not necessarily the case that the basic income has to be above subsistence levels. It's whatever we feel is optimal for the economy, and we can certainly argue about all of that. But he is definitely thinking of a basic income that provide subsistence. So that might be important for some of his points. Okay, that was my little note. So here's an interesting one. Small scale trials of basic income show most people would still work, but basic income could break the link between work and consumption. So here he's trying to make the argument for why basic income could help the environment. And I'm going to finish reading this. We all do it, saying, I worked so hard, I deserve that fancy meal, new gadget, or long-haul flight. Consumption is the payback for being ever more productive at work. Indeed, it makes little sense to curb consumption when we know we will have to be ever more productive at work regardless of our choices.
That is so true.
So, okay, but this is also not one of the things that anybody brought up when we initially went around the table. So I want to go around the table again and ask people.
Say that again, please. What's this?
The idea that the connection between basic income and the environment is somehow the idea that people are working so hard so they feel like they deserve to consume so they consume more. And then a basic income, because people won't have to work as hard, they won't feel the need to consume as much.
So remember what I said was
Yeah.
a link between patterns of consumption and basic income.
Yeah.
I didn't qualify what that link was.
Oh, so this falls under your, yeah.
It's in the Venn diagram of the two. It could be good, it could be bad, it could kind of
Right.
overlap. In other words, I keep harkening back to my idea of, the limits of the power to predict, which is to say that I don't know if this is right or wrong. I'm willing to concede it's out there that it might be or might not be this. It might not be this. It might be this. It may be no change from status quo regardless. I just don't feel I can predict that.
Okay. What do you think about that?
I have a strong feeling that this is not very likely to happen.
This is not very likely to
But
happen?
I think that it's possible. I think UBI could have helpful impacts for the environment, but I would not expect it to happen this way. And the reason that I would say this is that in general, in the work that I do, I study where people's beliefs and ideologies come from, and often they follow from what you're kind of capable of doing. So if you're capable of buying more stuff, you'll come up with some justification. And the fact that people happen to justify it by the fact that they've worked doesn't mean that they won't come up with some other justification for buying the stuff that they want if they're not working for it. And in fact, if you look at historical examples, like people who were not working as much for their money at other periods of time, like people who owned land in Europe, for example, I don't know that they bought any less stuff because they weren't working for it. It was now they have to uphold the standards of their social class, and that's the justification. They buy all sorts of stuff to do that. But in general, the motivations stay the same, to show off whatever wealth you do have, to have comfort, to have enjoyment. Those motivations aren't going to change. So I find this very uncompelling, personally. And I don't think that the fact that people work has all that much to do with what they're spending. I would more think that maybe if people are a little bit wealthier, they can start to care about some of these more almost luxury issues, like having a better impact on the environment, stuff like that. And when you're just subsisting, you can't really worry about that as much. That would be more where I might think this would come from.
Yeah. I mean, I guess my original or initial reaction is that, that rings true for me. I mean, when I was working a full-time job, I just felt like I should be spending as much money as I want, right? Especially take out food, and so I wouldn't have to cook. Why should I have to cook? I get all this, so there was always that psychology
Oh, that's interesting.
tied into it. But if you have a basic income and you don't have a sense that you don't have a sense of resentment about the kind of work that you're doing.
Right.
If basic income frees you to do some kind of work or no work that you care about, or I don't think that's a motivation. But you're right that there are people, and I know them, that will find ways to buy stuff for any reason. Right. That just happens to be one that I identify with. But I mean, I know people that are really shopaholics and want to go and buy and just acquire.
Yeah.
And I don't think that will be changed. by basic income, but that's all in the realm of psychology of money.
Right. But you also remind me of some other things, which is like, if you're really unhappy, maybe you're purchasing things to kind of compensate,
Definitely.
or if you don't have any time.
Retail therapy,
Yeah,
as they call it, yeah.
Exactly. So
Right.
maybe some of that could change, or
Right.
having the time to cook if you want to. Or
Yeah.
It reminds me of talking with my son over the weekend. He just finished up an internship at an international bank, and he was talking about some of the traders. And the way my son put it was, and we were talking about weightlifting, and some people use electric things up to stimulate the blood up on it.
Yeah, right.
And my son's kind of like natural workout and that kind of stuff. And he talked about that a lot of the traders in his company, they do this whole electrical kind of stimulation, supposed to, faster, stronger, less time.
Really?
And then my son uses this expression of talking about, I don't know if I have traders, but he uses this expression, if their money can do it for them, they let their money do it. In the sense of,
Yeah, right,
everything.
Right.
And, but a little bit to, some of the discussion here, the
Right.
psychology of it.
Yeah.
Right.
That's the way he put it. If their money can do it for them, they let their money do it.
Right. So then, if you're wealthy, that doesn't necessarily cut back on
Right.
consumption.
Right.
You think of more ways to spend it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there are like these, I don't know much about this, but there's the stereotype and these of like these Instagram accounts by really wealthy teenagers. I mean, they haven't earned any of the money, and they like showing off all the things they're buying and all this stuff. So,
Yeah.
so I don't know that it's limited to
To that.
that
That's
kind
one
of motive.
part
Yeah.
of it, but yeah.
I found one citation about the agriculture, by the way. So this is secondhand, but it's in an article. So Steve Sexton, assistant professor in the Stanford School of Public Policy at Duke, argues that large-scale monocrop farms actually use fewer resources and cause less harm to the environment than small-scale farms with diverse crops. The gains in efficiency debatably outweigh the limited carbon avoidance from reduced food miles. So even though it takes some to transport, his argument is that it's less. And so one thing he did was to look at a scenario in which all food was grown locally, and he concluded that the acres, fertilizer, chemical pesticides, et cetera, needed to make the shift would increase by 20 to 40%. So that's one person, that's one of the professors that's arguing that.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yep. So I can just click on that actual article.
Richard,
So
do you have
Freakonomics talks about it too.
any thoughts about this quote?
Oh, sorry.
Well, we were talking about other things, so I
Okay.
haven't built a chance to think about it all.
Yeah. So I mean, I really strongly agree with Bethany on this. It does not feel to me that people feeling like they deserve to consume because of how hard they work is a huge contributor to consumption, let alone the kind of consumption that would impact the environment. Because like even if you're doing retail therapy or buying a lot of stuff
Rewards,
for
yeah.
whatever reason, that does not necessarily correspond to the kind of consumption that's going to damage the environment. It doesn't necessarily correspond to natural resources that we need to conserve. It doesn't necessarily have to correspond to any kind of pollution. So all of that stuff can still exist without necessarily having the negative environmental impact it has now. And also, if we had a basic income, I think basic income helps the environment, but I don't think it necessarily reduces the amount that people want to consume. But I also think that's okay.
Wait, so how does it help by not reducing the amount people consume? I mean,
It doesn't help by not reducing the amount
Right,
that they
but
consume.
the amount that people consume does have some effect on the environment. I mean, that is.
Well, it depends. Like, which kind of consumption are you talking about? Are you talking about the kind of consumption that environmentalists would talk about, or are you talking about the kind of consumption that economists would talk about?
Mhm.
So environmentalists are worried about pollution, and they're worried about
Right.
using up, natural resources that we need to conserve.
Right.
Whereas economists are concerned with the kind of consumption that benefits people, and the kind of consumption that benefits people is the kind of consumption that rich people do. It's the kind of consumption that people who work, like when you're buying stuff, you want to buy what benefits you.
But
You're not trying to create as much pollution as possible.
It's not that strict a separation. It's there because in order to make the stuff that satisfy people to buy, then there are resources used to create those materials.
Right. So what I was saying before is that not all resources are equal. there are lots of resources where we could use a lot more of it and it actually wouldn't hurt the environment, like sunlight and that kind of thing.
Right.
But it's not just sunlight. There are plenty of resources that are sustainable or renewable, and they can substitute for other resources that might have more of a damaging impact on the environment.
Like if you buy a lot of items in Second Life or something online, it's
Buy a
not
lot of items.
items in like some virtual world like Second Life, or that's an old one. But that's not using resources to the same extent. I mean, it's maybe a little bit
Right,
of
we're
electricity.
talking about materials
But
here
but
usually,
I think
right?
the point that we're talking about is like, how are people spending the money? Like they
Yeah,
might be
like
buying
cars,
right. They
buying
might be buying
things.
cars, or they might be like joyriding their cars using lots of gasoline all over the
But
country.
even
Or they
buying
might
a
be doing
car,
something
there's
else. Yeah.
resources being used to make that
Totally,
car.
yeah. So that's a high resource one in my example, and then like a bunch of internet stuff is like a low resource.
Right.
example.
Right. So it's
More
all
likely in
cons-
between those things.
Right.
So the important thing is that it's all consumption from an
Right.
economics perspective, and some of it has no negative impact on the environment, and some of it has a very high impact
Right,
on the
right.
environment, and then there's in between.
Right.
So in order to support the environment, help the environment stay healthy, we would want to mitigate the amount to which our consumption is causing the negative kind of impacts, and
Right.
we want to
So
direct
that-
people more
that then
towards.
supports that point that people buying more stuff actually it has a negative impact.
Well, it depends on what stuff they're buying.
That's right.
Right.
It does.
Yeah.
But
Um,
I think more people are buying cars and objects and things for their houses than buying stuff virtually. I mean,
maybe I don't. Like it depends what you mean by more. In terms of the amount of money being spent in the economy, like the vast majority of it is on financial transactions and buying
Right.
assets and selling assets and stuff that uses up no resources, right?
But that's per dollar rather than per how much what people are. I don't know if you
Per
want it
dollar
per
spent.
person.
I mean, so there's a lot of ways to kind of break this down, and yeah, we want to reduce the negative environmental impact, but that's not necessarily saying the same thing as reducing consumption. Reducing consumption is another thing.
Okay.
Reducing consumption means getting people to buy less stuff.
right.
That doesn't necessarily have anything to do with whether that stuff
I know
is
that's the
bad for
point
the
you're
environment.
making, but
Yeah.
I'm not there yet. I mean, I don't see why reducing the amount of stuff that's been produced wouldn't also reduce environmental impact, because you've got factories that make the stuff. You've got-
What if you're reducing the amount of solar energy that's produced?
Well, right, but is everything equal in this discussion? I mean,
I'm saying not everything's equal. So instead of talking about increasing consumption as a whole, we should talk about what types of resources we want to conserve and what kind of production processes are causing pollution that we want to mitigate.
I guess I think in this quote, it's really specific about this, that you're buying stuff that would potentially affect the environment. You're buying food, you're buying a new gadget, you're buying, going on a
So
flight.
he's assuming that the stuff people will buy will necessarily hurt the environment.
Right, that is the assumption.
He's making that
And
assumption.
he's giving examples for
But
that.
I think
Right.
most of the stuff that we currently spend money on does hurt the environment at least a little bit. So I think that's a fair point. Like that the average person spends money on.
Yeah, then we're not talking about solar energy.
I mean, if you're a rich person and you're buying a painting, I mean, like we talked about before, the stuff rich people spend money on has very little impact on the environment.
But we already, I think we all accepted that point.
Right.
We did all accept that point, but I'm bringing it back as a reminder in the current discussion, right?
Okay.
So you're talking about people who,
Workers, I mean, that, I'm
well, I
just
mean,
using
so I
that.
want to give you an example of,
Yeah.
of retail therapy.
Yeah.
So the stuff people are buying, it might be really expensive stuff, right? And if it's really expensive stuff, then they're using up the same amount of resources as they would if they had bought, a cheap pair. So if they bought a really fancy pair of shoes, it uses up the same amount of resources as a cheap pair of shoes.
Okay,
So the extra spending, the extra consumption is actually not wasting any additional resources.
interesting, that's
Yeah.
another point, doesn't an additional,
It's the same point I'm trying to
you
make.
think so?
Yes.
I don't know, let's see, it's the same.
Okay.
Because now you're talking about the differences in spending levels, and having to do with consumption. I'm just talking about consumption itself, and maybe different kinds of consumption, but not differences.
So
in
we're talking
whether
about
buying an expensive thing or an inexpensive.
we're talking about the connection between money. So consumption is how much money you're spending and buying. So in economic terms, a pair of shoes that costs 50 times as much is
Right.
50 times as much stuff in
Right.
economic terms.
Okay,
In environmental terms, it's the same amount of stuff.
right, okay.
Right. So you're consuming more, but you're not having more of an impact on the environment. Yeah, go ahead.
There are also things like biological and like cultural and technological perspectives. Like in Knights of Sidonia, an anime on like Netflix, they genetically altered themselves that they could need one meal per week, and then they can like produce their own food via photosynthesis. Or if you want to become a cyborg, you can have like in Ghost in the Shell, you could have your own cyborg body and just need like replacement parts or electricity to power you.
Yeah.
So you would use far less resources.
Yeah.
That way.
Something to look forward to.
Yeah. So Jeff is bringing up the issue of water. So he's asking how we feel about building dams, even though those dams might cause fish to die or species to go extinct and that kind of thing. I think these are trade-offs. Obviously, I would prefer not to kill all the fish and not to make species go extinct. I don't know. I think there's a trade-off to be made there, and I can't speak personally. I can't speak to whether we're on the right end of those trade-offs or not. And then in terms of the scarcity of water, this is a really interesting thing because we all agree that people should have enough fresh drinking water to live healthy lives. But then how do you conserve the additional water? There was this meme going around a little while ago about the CEO of Nestle saying that water was not a human right. And what he meant by that was that, we want to find ways to conserve water. Of course, people should have drinking water, but should it be a human right that you should have enough fresh, clean water to water your lawn or wash your car or fill your swimming pool and that kind of thing? Or should you have to maybe pay for it? But there were people who were very upset about his statement that water shouldn't be a human right. I think partly because they misconstrued it as him saying that drinking water shouldn't be a human right. But it's very interesting because people have opinions about these kinds of resources that they feel they should have access to that might not be in line with what's sustainable for
What there's also with Nestle there in Michigan and other places with lower water rights, they like pay a town for per 1,000 gallons, they pay them $3.95 or that, something like that, and then they sell it for $1 a bottle or something. So
you're talking about the bottled water?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, in Flint? You mean
They're not-
Michigan?
They're not getting their water from Flint, Michigan.
No,
Nobody
but
would
they
wanna
might
do
be
that.
selling water there. They should be selling water.
I think
there, bottled water.
They're more likely to be handing out free water in places
Yeah,
like that.
probably should be. Yeah.
Well, that's interesting. Sultan says in an average home, showers are typically the third largest water use after toilets and clothes washers.
Huh. Interesting.
So it's washers.
Yeah. So there's also this idea of gray water, recycling water that is basically usable for most things, but you wouldn't want to drink it.
Oh, great.
Yeah, it's called gray water. It's not like sewage water, but it's
Right.
also not drinking water. Yeah, go ahead.
that's a big thing in Japan. They do that. They they save their bathing water and things like that, and they use it to water their plants. And there's also like for showers, they can have like filters so they keep reusing the water and so they don't have to keep heating it.
That's
Okay.
cool.
Cool. That's really So lots of interesting ideas for how to conserve water. Desalinization is probably not the cheapest way to go.
Right. Unless we you never know, you keep talking about predicting the future. If we came up with a little, I don't know, this is not going to be scientifically valid, bacteria that ate all the salt or some weird new way of doing it, that might change things.
How do you get rid of
Probably the
bacteria?
nearest way to do
Yeah,
it
I
is
don't know.
make the electricity cheaper.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was trying to think of something sensible. Tiny nano robots, maybe that eat the salt and then leave.
That eat the salt and leave, so you
And
press the
somehow
button and
don't
it'll
take much
swim away.
energy. Yeah. Really.
Yeah.
Doesn't make sense.
That's
They can also like genetically alter things so they're more resistant to salt. Like during what happened during like millions of years ago, I think it was Cambrian or something like that. They're 300 million years ago. There was a population might decline, and so everything had to become more resistant to sulfur, and that's why we need so much sulfur these days.
So Jeff says, when water is artificially cheap, waste happens. So I think that's right. We waste water if we can just get as much as we want for free. That's a good point. Okay, so those are all the comments I had for the first article. Before we move on to the second one, does anyone have any more thoughts? Okay.
I think we should move on with it.
Yeah. So this second article is a lot of experts talking about the issue of pollution in New York in the 1970s, or the environment in New York in general. And I think this is interesting because, we talked about how people living in cities is more efficient overall for the health of the planet than having people spread out. But yet within these cities, you have a concentration of pollution and, bad environmental conditions. But one thing that's cool about having it all concentrated in one place, is that you can try to address it all in one place. And this article, I think, is an example of that. Like, we've got this problem in New York City. What kind of things can we do to address this problem here? If this problem were dispersed across the entire planet, it would be a much more difficult problem to address. So obviously this was from 1970, and a lot of the ideas in here didn't really come to fruition. We're not flying in skyscrapers sideways and then turning them right side up and flying in the cities.
Prefabricating skyscrapers that way. They want Buckminster Fuller wanted to fly them in and then sit them up vertically.
What was the problem that was trying to solve? I didn't read the full article.
The problem it's trying to solve is the environmental impact of all the construction that's going on. So if you could construct them somewhere in a facility, the way Boeing constructs airplanes or something like that, and constructs the pieces and then assemble it all, and then fly it in and then set it vertically, then you've got your skyscraper, and you didn't have to have this big messy construction project in the middle of New York City. So let's get to some quotes here. So this is what I was talking about before. I actually didn't write down who said all of these quotes, so I don't remember who said this. It's kind of a bunch of different experts all kind of providing their opinions. And this one is
a panel.
The city has become a kind of pathological Bromignac, a monster whose death throes we are already
participating.
Yeah. Yeah.
So dramatic.
That's it.
That's from Gulliver's Travels.
Yeah, the giant city. Yeah. So so I mean, this is clearly New York City did not die. We weren't necessarily participating in its death throes, but I thought that was an interesting quote. We kind of already talked about it, unless someone has something else to offer. So here's one. Its virus is population concentration. So this is New York City's virus. Its salvation lies in decentralization, to be accomplished by large-scale planning for dispersion into a number of small cities distributed across a large regional transportation grid.
Like suburbs.
Like suburbs, yeah, or just like
Exurbs.
It almost sounds like the Boston area.
It does.
Like, because you've got like Somerville,
Yeah,
Cambridge,
all the little cities.
little cities and the subway and stuff, and it's not like this huge it's not anywhere near as dense as New York.
yeah.
Well, they have boroughs.
They do, yeah, that's true.
Yeah, and one of the other people was talking about like having like each borough have its own downtown. That's kind of almost equivalent to downtown Manhattan, and then kind of spreading it out that way.
Oh.
So I don't know. I don't know if this is. What do you guys think about this idea? Do you think it would have helped New York? Do you think it would have been a good thing?
Yeah, I'd say in the context of 1970.
Yeah.
It falls in the category of stuff that wasn't really pulled off. I mean, a lot of people, I mentioned like this home I lived in, and it went from $80,000 to $750,000 in a very short period of time, in terms of number of years. But why? Because the whole yuppie, this sort of early '80s yuppie, working in New York City but living in suburbia, and so you had White Plains, but you had towns like the town where I lived, and the next town over, and that sort of thing, and that's what naturally happened, so to speak.
Right.
The trains were always there.
Yeah.
People just, it was a lot more complicated than just any one factor, but certainly that whole upwardly mobile, younger people work in the city but don't live in the city dynamic, you could really see play out in real estate values and
Gentrification.
where I live.
Gentrification, yeah. I mean, I think it already kind of happened. I'm not sure. I guess this is wished for as a solution.
So
To what though? Solution to what? The problem of
I don't think
population?
think they're just talking about people having their residences outside of the city. I think they're talking about like creating city centers that are in addition to downtown Manhattan.
City center.
Like even if you're living in New Jersey, you're still commuting to New York, and maybe your nightlife is in New York or something like that. But they're talking about creating the city center. Also, so instead of commuting into New York, you'd have a city center to commute to near you.
Little Manhattans.
Yeah, that's
This is
exactly.
I
That's
think
the
this is
point.
kind of how Boston was.
Trying to
Because
do that. I think
I go
that's
to
how Cambridge is.
I go to Central Square, not like Boston, to get fancy or something.
Right.
So that's
I think
kind of
that's
the
right.
same idea.
And I think
What
this
did you
is
say about that?
Well, like in Cambridge, I might go to Central Square to go out. I wouldn't necessarily go all the way to Boston.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And Brooklyn and New York is starting to be like that.
Yeah,
People go
yeah.
just in Brooklyn and then always go to Manhattan.
How you define
Yeah, and I
city
think-
center. It's not gonna be exactly like Manhattan, because then you just have another New York City in another place.
I mean, that's what they're talking about doing.
Only on a smaller scale.
Well, they're talking about lessening the scale of New York City itself by providing these alternative cities in the area. Yeah, and I think Bethany is right that in places like Brooklyn, people don't necessarily go into the city that much for their nightlife, but still for like the big jobs and like all of the high level stuff, like they would still commute for their jobs at least. So
Yeah.
I
guess an interesting question this raises is like outside of work, and not that people wouldn't be working with a basic income, but like outside of work, what kinds of population structures do people prefer? It's a little bit like your internet question, like if people could work from anywhere, like what are the other social benefits they get from being concentrated and like versus the cost, and how concentrated do people want to be versus like having more space or like less crime or less disease, like just for whatever it is. This is an interesting question.
I think it's an interesting question, and my hunch is that people will still want to be pretty concentrated, but they might concentrate themselves. They might choose to concentrate themselves in different areas, and like if there are areas that are cheaper but maybe didn't have great jobs or something like that, you might see more concentrations of people there. So I think
the
I just
job thing, the job thing is important. I mean, whenever you go somewhere and see a great place to live,
Right.
the first question is, but how do people earn a living here? I mean, that used to be my
Right,
question.
yeah.
How could we move here? You can't move here unless there are jobs here.
right.
But you could if you didn't have to worry about
Right.
those jobs anymore. Right?
Yep.
You just still need, I guess, the infrastructure stuff we're talking about, like with the internet and your friends.
Yep.
You need infrastructure, and young people, I think, are always going to want to be pretty concentrated to meet other potential partners.
Right.
Because when you live around a lot of people, you can
To get out and walk about and, you know, see things, go to
Yeah.
shops, go to the gym, and do that in a very small
Yeah.
space, to get in the car.
Yeah, not having to drive is also
Yeah.
really nice. But you don't need you don't need to be in Manhattan and not have to drive. Something like Cambridge is sufficient.
Yeah.
So I think I disagree with the idea that its virus is population concentration. I think
Yeah.
population concentration is fantastic. If you live in New York City, you see some of the negative side effects of it because they're all, you know, right in front of you right there. But then it gives you an opportunity to address it in this concentrated way, and I think that's a good thing. And I think, you know,
Being in
Yeah.
nature is really nice for a lot of people too. I mean, New York has the Central Park, which is quite large,
Yeah.
but just also for air quality and all sorts of other things.
Yeah.
That is more difficult to have if you have population concentration.
right. It's difficult to have, but it's also if the air pollution is all kind of localized or centralized, then it's easier to address. It's just what
Yeah, maybe.
And I guess there's a question too about population concentration and amount of crime.
Mhm.
I mean, just logically, it would seem to be more opportunity for crime
Right,
when
there's
there are more people there. But when, you know, when people are less concentrated, would there then be fewer criminals? I don't know if
Yeah, I
there's a
don't know.
connection there.
Some people fear not being able to be helped by the police too when they're too far
If they're
away.
not right in the city,
Yeah.
I know.
So I guess there's both sides. But
Yeah,
certainly in the suburbs, it seems like it's a sweet spot where you have police with the crime is really low, at least like an active room.
right.
Yeah. Yeah, and crime is a whole other thing. You know, that basic income could have a pretty huge
Well, it
impact
has to
on.
do with poverty levels and all that.
Crime would be a cool topic.
Crime would be a cool topic.
Yeah.
Yeah, we might do that for a
Yeah,
upcoming one.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the next quote I have is pretty much saying the opposite. The life of the city is people. Take away the bustle from Fifth Avenue and you would hate it. Besides, concentration,
By concentration.
by concentration, you make it possible to have all sorts of conveniences practically within arm's reach. Restaurants, entertainment, stores of all kinds.
right. So we're just-
High-speed fiber optic internet,
Yeah.
which they didn't say in the 70s.
Right.
It was
Yeah.
true. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's right. I think this is more in line with kind of what I feel. This quote doesn't address the pollution issue, but it does talk about some of the benefits of concentration. And I think concentration helps us with the environment too, keeping the people concentrated and letting the environment, you know, not be impacted as much by people, the outside environment.
And I think as Jeff points out and others, like public health and safety, like crime, those things are not for people are not necessarily helped by being in the city without taking a lot of extra measures. Like,
Yeah, you gotta have the extra measures in there. For an individual person, maybe it's, you know, you get cleaner air and you're safer or something if you're living out in the suburbs. But then if everyone did that, that would kind of reduce the
Right.
quality of the environment for everyone in the world.
Right.
So I think that's
for
true.
some people, the bustle of Fifth Avenue is not ideal, actually. They'd rather be in
Right.
nature,
Yeah,
have
yeah,
privacy. You know,
Right.
if
So
they were able to do that, we might see many more people living that way. Right now, they can't because the jobs are
right.
concentrated in that area.
So UBI
Yeah.
could disperse people, which
Yeah.
could also be hard on the environment, good for people's health in the short term. But
yeah, or maybe instead of being on Fifth Avenue with the bustle, you're in Central Park.
Yeah.
You can't be in Central Park. Oh, you mean you're walking there?
Yeah, instead of walking down Fifth Avenue to
you
your
live
job
there.
in finance or whatever, you're hanging out in Central
For
Park.
that
Yeah.
bustle, the free bustle.
Yeah.
In Central Park.
Then Central Park's going to be really crowded. Yeah, I'm not too worried about basic income magically causing everyone to like want to go live out in nature, and certainly if it did, then you would want to put constraints on the amount of the basic income.
Really?
Again, this brings
Well,
me back to my other question.
Because if everybody's living out in nature, it destroys the planet. Is the problem, right? Like the planet benefits a lot from people concentrating themselves in
Right.
cities.
But
Yeah.
couldn't you also try to mitigate the effect of people being out in nature, like kind of like solar energy or other things. So like,
Oh, sure. Yeah.
because there are other options besides. Yeah, I mean, I could imagine ways for people to live less concentrated that wouldn't be as damaging. It's just kind of the way that it is. I mean, some of them are inevitable, like the infrastructure is more efficient, but
Yeah.
some of them are not. Like if you're able to have solar energy and other things like that.
Yeah. Or maybe people take, day trips in electric cars to go explore, nature and that kind of thing. Yeah. I mean, there's all kinds of possibilities. It's not just saying we're going to like lock everyone in the city and say you can't leave. I don't think that's what we need to do. Yeah. Yeah. This is interesting. So this quote says, "It's clear New York is beyond the automobile age." This is 1970, remember. "The car is going to have to be banned, at least from Manhattan. There are many cities of this country that are products of the automobile age. They are scaled to such a transportation mode, and sure, cars are fine there, but not in New York. It's a post-automobile town." So that didn't happen.
No, although I know
But it
that
should happen.
people from New York often don't have a driver's license.
That's true.
It's not
Yeah.
empty of automobiles, but a lot of people just take cabs or like they just
A lot of
take
people will
seat
never
or they
drive
walk.
in Manhattan.
Yeah.
The T
Yeah.
is everything. The T
Yeah.
and the
The
subway.
subway,
Yeah.
Yeah. Most people who live in New York don't drive cars and don't have cars. But the streets are still clogged with cars.
They are.
So that hasn't gone away.
Right.
Too bad.
I think it's a little bit too bad. Soon they'll be clogged with electric cars that are self-driving Ubers, and maybe that problem will solve itself in that way. I just thought that was an interesting,
That is interesting.
interesting thing.
Speaks to
An interesting wish.
about predictions. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think we're getting past the pollution from automobiles, not by. I mean, to some extent, people living in cities not having cars really helps, but also by advancing the technology and making it more efficient. Oh, so here's a really good quote. This one's from Buckminster Fuller, and I've actually used this quote before.
Oh yeah.
Oh, yeah.
"We must do away with the absolutely specious notion that everybody has to earn a living. It is a fact today that 1 in 10,000 of us can make a technological breakthrough capable of supporting all the rest. The youth of today are absolutely right in recognizing this nonsense of earning a living. We keep inventing jobs because of this false idea that everybody has to be employed at some kind of drudgery, because according to the Malthusian Darwinian theory, he must justify his right to exist. So we have inspectors of inspectors and people making instruments for the inspectors to inspect inspectors. The true business of people should be to go back to school and think about whatever it was they were thinking about before somebody came along and told them they had to earn a living." So I mean, yeah, if he's right that, we can get by with a lot fewer people working in a lot fewer jobs, then that's better for the environment and it's better for people. People can have more freedom to decide how they want to spend their time and stimulate themselves intellectually is what he's suggesting. But, people do all kinds of things.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Anyone have any thoughts about that quote?
I think that's a good kind of thing we talk about a lot.
That's the kind of thing we talk about a lot, so there might not be that much more to say about it. So this is the last quote.
Well, again, just think of it in the context of when it was said.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
It
interesting.
was
Yeah.
pretty radical
It is great.
at that time.
I think he was right, though. I think he was even right back then.
It's interesting
Yeah.
his quote that the youth were already recognizing that at the time.
Yeah.
Because those people have gone on to get jobs and not really reject the idea of making a living because you can't, because there's no basic
There
income.
was no way to do
Right.
it.
So like even if they were rejecting it at the time, it kind of really
Right.
Yeah.
Society
Go
forced them
anywhere.
to earn a living.
yeah.
Well,
We can't just it can't just be like an individual person says, "I'm giving up on the idea of earning a living." It's like,
Right.
society has to change.
That was a favorite
Yeah.
idea of Eric's. for a
Yeah.
long time.
But it's also interesting because I feel like subsequent generations haven't even rejected this idea. I don't know what was going on with the youth in the 70s, but in the
Yeah.
our generation doesn't really reject things like that. They kind of just like want to be successful
Don't
in a
want-
job.
don't
I mean,
want-
at least in Acton, students weren't thinking so radically about jobs.
Oh, no.
They generally
no.
were thinking like, what job am I going to get? And how
Oh,
it's
yeah,
gonna be
I
good.
think that was a time when, I mean, anti-materialism, and, I mean, Buckminster Fuller, I think of him as a 60s kind of guru
Right.
person. But even so, I mean, a lot of his thinking is still relevant. It's
Right.
not irrelevant. It's just that at that time there was no real place for it.
Yeah, right.
Just like you're saying, how do you reject a job?
Yeah.
Everybody may have, or a lot of people may believe that
Right.
intellectually or idealistically.
But there was
But
no,
in reality, how do you do that?
right.
you have
So
to live.
to earn something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. So here's the last quote. Our economic growthmanship has trapped us. We have everybody working on a 6-day treadmill and moonlighting so they can continue to cycle junk through their houses. We should find out how much gross national product the country really needs and try to produce it in the most relaxed, aesthetic way possible. So
Yeah.
it's interesting. I certainly agree with producing everything we can using a minimum amount of labor, and as efficiently as possible, and minimally wasteful of resources and minimally polluting and stuff. I don't know that necessarily goes against economic growthmanship. So we can grow the economy and produce more, while at the same time, striving to waste less.
Right.
Um,
Well, there's an aesthetic too that we don't adhere to at all. Minimalism. I mean, the way to live, cycle junk through their houses. I mean, everybody's house, including mine, is completely stuffed with useless.
Because you're not cycling it enough. It's
I'm not
disgusting.
cycling at all.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm cycling as fast as I can.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I
There's
mean, the
there's some-
aesthetic of minimalism with the Japanese houses. I mean, that's a great aesthetic.
Yeah.
And it's beautiful. But we're not, that's a cultural thing. We're not interested in that. We're acquiring.
Yeah. So we might benefit from some shifts in culture.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Did you ask
Well, I read some of this kind of thing, and I think of my Russian spy, former communist, and talking about the virtues of Marx and Lenin and superiority of Eastern Slavic culture, emphasis on thought, and she says all these things from a multi-million-dollar Moscow apartment, multiple expensive cars, jet setting the kids and parents all over the world. Sweetie, you're a long way from communism, the way I see it.
Right, that's funny. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the reality and the ideology don't always come together.
Yeah.
Don't always
Yeah,
match.
that's interesting. Yeah. I mean, I think if Katie were here too, she'd probably comment on just some of the values questions, which is
Yeah.
how should individuals live their lives to maximize also their well-being in addition to the planet. And
Just even us sitting and talking about this is kind of I use the word privilege, but it is a kind of privileged position.
yeah,
I mean, people who are not surviving, or they're only barely surviving, don't have time to sit around thinking about survival
right.
or how it's best done and all of that. So,
Right.
I mean, it is cultural and it's also class.
Right. I was also thinking about some of the ways that technology is changing some of this stuff, like with Uber, meaning it's easier not to own a car if you're kind of on the edge, or I forget if someone else last time was talking about the apps where you can share a drill, because most people own a drill
right.
and they never use
Yes,
the drill, they
that's right.
use it
Yeah, that
once.
was
Yeah,
cool.
that's a great.
Yeah.
Sultan, was talking about that. So there maybe are some other clever ways that people can still get the value they want from
Yes.
having access to things.
Yeah.
I've thought of this with clothes, if you had a place, a catalog online for clothes, and you could just get have your collection that you also share with other people somewhere. Just all these things that we don't use that efficiently it'd be interesting if technology could help us use more of the objects efficiently, so that would be good for the environment, and
Yeah,
also not cluttering up
definitely.
your house with all this stuff.
Yeah.
But see what happens with that.
All right. So in conclusion, basic income can have an impact on the environment in all kinds of interesting ways. I think, the biggest one is lessening the waste of resources that's involved in kind of creating all these jobs that might no longer be necessary once we have a basic income. But there's more to it than that. So yeah, thanks everyone.
Yeah,
Pretty
really
great
interesting
discussion.
as usual. Thank
Silken
you.
and Jeff.
Next week, we're going to be talking about freedom.
Oh, boy.
And I don't have an
Yeah,
article
freedom.
picked out yet, but if anyone has any